Okay, here's the thing. I love Receiver 2, but that statement has an asterisk on it which grows larger every time I play the game. Receiver 2 is a post-apocalyptic, run-based gun mechanic simulation first-person shooter. Let it be known, this is the exact same description I used for Receiver 1. For something that came out of a 7-day FPS game jam, Receiver 1 did a fascinating job of conveying the inherent challenge of handgun operation. Receiver 2 is nearly identical to its predecessor, but with finalized assets, an expanded selection of guns with more detailed simulations, and dramatically more audio logs and journals to find. It's so similar that I feel weird calling it Receiver 2, and not Receiver, but actually this time. Or really just considering this to be Receiver and retiring the Game Jam version entirely. Receiver scratches a very particular itch that I have. It sets itself in a lore that revolves around mental awareness, perceptions of reality, and the liminal channels through which realities can bleed into each other. Even the trailer includes a line.
If you are listening to this message in a promotional context, your mind is already under attack by the threat.
To suggest that our reality is among those being crossed into. But at the same time, it approaches its lore with an absurd bluntness that I love. The apocalyptic event which occurred is called the Mind Kill. Survivors of the Mind Kill have done so through the use of mind tech and are now experiencing the dreaming. Using phrases like mind kill and mind tech while keeping a straight face is exactly the kind of humor that gets me to buy in. But I think my favorite thing about Receiver is that it reminds me of a mech sim. What games usually abstract out, this makes explicit. While most games would put reload on a single key like R, here it's E, Tab, Z a couple of times, Tab, Z, and then R. And that's only for guns that are magazine fed, have a side lock, and were emptied through firing. Don't even get me started on revolvers. This is actually how the game really succeeds at making its guns the stars. If you build skill in a game like Counter-Strike by learning the patterns and rhythms of the maps, you do it in Receiver by forming mental muscle memory around the unique nuances of how each gun operates. The core challenge is having familiarity. Building familiarity often goes hand in hand with building fondness, and as I spend more time with the game, I can absolutely feel myself enjoying the time that I'm spending learning these guns. Which is actually a feeling I'm supremely uncomfortable having. But that's not the only part of the game that makes me uncomfortable, and sometimes even outright angry. Receiver 2 is one of those cases where honestly it would have been better if the game just said less. In the process of fleshing out every part of Game Jam Receiver into a proper release, there's been a ton of writing added to the game. This new writing takes a number of forms, including journal entries, mental conditioning training tapes, encyclopedic descriptions of the featured guns, anecdotes about the history of handguns, long-standing rules of firearm safety, and even borderline conspiracy theory style warnings. Every one of these feels like it comes from an entirely different source than the rest, even though only certain selections are explicitly attributed to in-world characters. But even the codex feels like Wikipedia-style multi-author writing, with how the entries snipe at and undercut each other. It really feels like all these different ideas were collected and just crammed in for the sake of feeling full. As a result, the authorial voice is a meandering mess, and any message the game sends reads like an incidental overlap rather than an intentional stance. Listen, having a messy message isn't always a big deal, but when you lean into sensitive topics like mental illness and suicide the way Receiver 2 does, it becomes imperative that you take responsibility for the message you're sending. One of the gameplay upgrades for Receiver 2 is that they have added a litany of problems for you to memorize how to deal with. While this includes multiple types of jams and malfunctions, it also takes the form of echoes of the threat. Echoes are trap audio logs which require you to quickly and completely disarm your gun, because by the end of the tape, it overrides your controls, points the gun directly at the screen, and pulls the trigger. And it's fucking chilling. Even if you've successfully disarmed a gun, watching this thing you have built familiarity with, that has even started to feel like an extension of yourself, literally turn on you and cycle through every cylinder desperately trying to kill you, it's a terrifying thing to watch. It gives me chills every single time it happens. It's a really, really effective moment. But for this game, That's actually the problem. Instead of using this really strong moment to establish a unifying tone for the game, it tries to treat it with the same weight as every other topic. The fictional journals, the real-world history, and the snide codex that makes erectile dysfunction jokes. But the truth is, the impact of these moments overshadows the rest, and it makes the whole game feel tone-deaf, like it doesn't recognize the topic it stumbled into. Except, it clearly knows that it's brought up this topic because it goes out of its way to point it out while pretending that it's not actually addressing it. You see, each threat echo tape not only turns your gun on you, but does so while reading aloud a suicide note written by an in-world character. Surviving the echo unlocks an additional audio log which provides further details about the author of the suicide note, and what they did after surviving the attempt. It describes how they would go on to seek support, take precautionary measures, and ultimately how they built themselves a foundation for combating the mindset that led to the attempt in the first place. And this sounds great! This sounds like the positive, constructive stance on mental health that this game is poised to take. Except it's not. Because what they've done is undercut any message that has even a chance to be more than just another responsible gun ownership related bit of information. You see, in Receiver, mental illness isn't real. Suicide and negative self-image, and even the harm that people cause each other in general, is the influence of capital T, the threat. A literal malevolent entity from a higher dimension that is invading this one for the sole purpose of annihilating humanity from the mind outwards. The game goes on to lay out the best ways to combat the threat. Techniques like self-awareness, skepticism and scrutiny, building social support structures for oneself, and of course, rigorous firearms training. Because even though it sounds exactly like the game is describing how to cope with mental illness using widely adopted cognitive therapy techniques, it's never presented without reminding you, this is all because of the threat, which is definitely real, and why you absolutely need a firearm to be a core part of your personal identity. Worse yet, the liminal channel the threat is using to intrude into our reality is just media. There is literally an audio log in this game that says,
"The media is a threat."
Now listen, I know that Game Jam Receiver came out in 2012, but we all experienced the 8 years since then together. You can't just use a phrase like that and pretend that it has no context outside of the little space you've built for celebrating guns. Now, I could handwave a lot of this if they made it out to be a case of unreliable narration. It wouldn't be that far to go, as everything written is implicitly generated by in-world characters. Except that the game begins in a post-Mindkill existence, meaning that, omniscient narration or not, all of the teachings presented are true. Everything that they lay out for you is meant to be taken as is. And then, the finale of the game is where they finally double back and touch upon that moment in the trailer, and triple down on the premise that our existence outside of the game is just a deeper level of their reality. Which means they're saying that, even in the real world, the threat is real, mental illness isn't, and you should own a gun. What the fuck? It's just so aggravating, and honestly at times insulting, that for using such surprisingly grounded and relatable depictions of mental illness, including the experience of losing control over your own body to what feels like an external force that seeks to do you harm, they do their damnedest to reject the metaphor it can't help but be, and instead try to fictionalize its depictions to justify why it's okay that their explicit message is essentially, you suicide 'cause you be on that phone! The message of the game is a complete, self-deceiving mess. But I kind of get it. After all, I truly do have fun playing with these mechanisms that the game is presenting. But I just can't fully come to terms with deriving any enjoyment from guns. I've considered the argument that guns are like power tools or industrial machinery, and are only dangerous when treated without the proper respect for their danger. But that argument breaks down immediately, because unlike most other tools you would list, their intended purpose is to be dangerous, to indiscriminately destroy whatever the barrel is pointed at, whether it's an inanimate target or a person. They've painted themselves into a corner. You can't have an examination of guns that is both thorough and also remains reverent in the face of the role that guns play in mental health. While I can't think of a clean way to do that either, they seem to have opted for maybe the most scumbag approach. Because, while most attempts at this just quietly turn a blind eye to any topics that don't paint the positive picture they want, Receiver 2 says, here are all these positive aspects we've drawn from reality, and here are the negative ones, which we've replaced with fiction, so we don't have to take a stand against any real-world issues and can remain entirely venerational. As much as I love this game mechanically, I can't overlook how it shoots itself in the foot by straining to not take a stance on the topics it brings up. It is a uniquely grounded depiction of guns in video games, and it prides itself on that and tries to expand on it, but then pulls its punches when it gets to talking about violence, trauma, mental health, and suicide. But no matter how desperately it doesn't want to be about these things, the fact is, they've made a game where the only person it's ever even possible to shoot is yourself.
I'm so sorry. I've always been such a disappointment. I would have just kept getting more pathetic. I can't stand to be a burden on you any longer. I hope one day you can forgive me. I love you. I'm sorry. This tape is designed to test your focus in the face of distraction. Maintain focus on your breathing. How did you do? If your attention wandered, that is normal. Just notice that without judgment. Let's try again. Good job.